I never imagined that in my 70s my heart could drop that fast, like a plate falling in slow motion, spinning, still beautiful for a breath, and then shatter. People tell you age makes you thick-skinned. Maybe that's true about winter wind and doctor bills. It is not true about words from your own child. It was my wife's birthday. We had the long oak table pulled out so far it almost kissed the living room rug. The grandkids' paper crowns lay scattered between the candles. Someone had put Aretha on low, as if her voice could hold the whole house together. The apple pie that always cracked along the same seam sat cooling near the window. I had just uncorked a bottle of red cheap, but it made the room smell like a promise. "Say something, son," my wife said, smiling that small, tired smile women learn after too many sleepless years. She looked toward our boy, my boy, who had his hands in his pockets like he was warming them at a fire only he could see. He cleared his throat, lifted his glass. The room hushed the way church does when the pastor closes his eyes. I folded my napkin, the cloth soft as an old memory. He looked at his mother. Then he looked at me, and he said, "I appreciate everything, but he's not my real dad. He's different. You can all see that." It was quiet enough to hear the ice sigh in the pitcher. I didn't move. Older men learn to be still the way soldiers learn to crawl. My fingers pressed little half-moons into the napkin. I felt every eye blow across me like cold rain, some pity, some confusion, a few nods, tiny, almost polite, as if a thought in their heads had finally found a voice. I want to tell you I stood up and thundered back the truth. I want to tell you I slammed down proof, rattled off dates and diapers, nights I held this boy while he sobbed about a girl who'd left him, mornings I worked the early shift so he could sleep after prom. I want to tell you I made a speech and it lifted the ceiling an inch with each word I threw. But I didn't. I did the hardest thing a father can do. I sat there and let my heart break in front of the people I love. Age gives you that, the ability to sit with the ache. My wife stared into her cake. Maybe she thought if she counted the strawberries she could count her way out of this moment. The grandkids looked from face to face, learning too early that families have weather patterns. I don't know what I looked like. Maybe a lighthouse with the light turned off. Maybe an old tree surprised by lightning. He said it again, this time softer, almost to himself. "Not my real dad." The thing about color is, people pretend it's a soft difference, like choosing blue socks instead of gray. But color can still turn a warm room cold. It can still write its own story across your skin and ask strangers to read it out loud in public places. I have lived long enough to know that. I have lived long enough to know a man can love a child until there's not a single dry mile left in him, and a single sentence can lay drought over all that land. The candles guttered. We sang anyway, off-key, brave, and cut the cake because birthdays are stubborn like that. My wife pressed a plate into my hands. I thanked her with my eyes. When we cleared the dishes, when the front door closed behind the last set of polite footsteps, I stayed at the table. I traced the small scratches where Lego bricks and high school textbooks had nibbled at the wood. Those scratches are our history. No one sands them away. I don't know how long I sat. The house changed around me. Light went dim to dusk, to the blue that rises from the floorboards when the day is finally done. I folded my napkin again. I told myself to stand up and couldn't. I told myself to forgive and couldn't. Forgiveness is a heavy coat. Some nights you can't get your arms through the sleeves. There is a reason I'm telling you this, friend. There is a reason I'm showing you the mess before I show you the miracle. If you've ever been the one who stayed, the one who showed up, the one who didn't quit and still someone looked at you and said you weren't real, then you already know why I'm telling it from the beginning. Stay with me to the end. I promise you the truth will be brighter than the pain. And if this story reaches you, do me a kindness. Tap like, hit subscribe, walk with me through this. Not for me so much as for all the fathers and sons sitting at tables like mine tonight, trying to figure out how to speak without making more cracks in the china. I took the pie plate to the sink. The faucet made the kind of music that doesn't ask for applause. When I turned, my wife was there in the doorway, arms crossed against a chill that wasn't in the air. "He didn't mean it," she said. People always mean it the first time, I said. She looked at me the way doctors look at X-rays. You'll talk to him when he's ready. What about you? She asked, and there it was, the question that never grows old. What about you? I am a black man in America, which means I've been mistaken for the wrong everything more times than I can count. Wrong door, wrong neighborhood, wrong voice on the phone when the bill collector called back. But I was never the wrong father. Not once. Not even at 3 in the morning when fever painted my boy a color I'd never seen, and I sat in the bathroom with him while the tub steamed the whole mirror blind. I was there then. I am here now. After she went to bed, I opened the drawer where we keep the old photos, the ones you can't swipe, the ones that smell like attic and lemon oil. There's one I keep near the top. I'm 28 in a shirt I thought made me look like a banker, and he's in a red onesie, no hair to speak of, fists balled like tiny commas. He's looking at me with that newborn expression that says, "Who are you and are you mine?" Every child asks it. Every father answers it, not with papers, not with speeches, but with years. I whispered to the picture, "I am." The house spoke in the language of old houses, pops and sighs. Outside, the streetlight did its lonely duty. Across the way, a teenager laughed too loud and tried to turn it into a cough. The city was doing what cities do, surviving. I washed the last fork and set it to dry. Sometime near midnight, I put on my jacket. The sleeves are shiny at the elbows. That's how you can tell what a man leans on. I walked the 3 blocks to the park where the swings scuff grooves into the dirt like handwriting. The benches still know the shape of me from years ago. I sat and I listened to the dark. There's a point in a long marriage where you start talking to your life the way you talk to a person. "All right," I said. "What now?" The answer came quiet and clear as a church bell in fog. "Be still. Tell the truth. Do not try to win." Win what? A son, a chess game, a courtroom you built inside your chest. I closed my eyes. On the back of my eyelids, memories paraded like old neighbors. The first t-ball game where he swung so hard he spun himself to the ground and looked up grinning. The spring we planted tomatoes and he named each plant after a superhero, because who wants to eat a tomato named Clark Kent? The way he called me dad in the cracked voice of adolescence, stretched between boy and man, as if he were testing the word for strength. And then the other memories, the ones that arrive with their shoes on and don't bother to knock. A relative's joke that wasn't a joke. A boy in the schoolyard saying, "You sure he's yours?" The time he came home from a friend's house quieter than usual, and when I asked how it went, he said, "Fine," and slammed a door slow like he was practicing for a bigger slam later. You can love a person and still lose them by inches. It's like a coastline wearing down. You don't notice until the sea is where your mailbox used to be. When dawn finally rolled the neighborhood back into color, I got up from the bench feeling older and somehow lighter, like truth had taken some weight off me ahead of schedule. I walked home to the smell of coffee. My wife poured 2 mugs without speaking. That is tenderness too. "I'm going to give him space," I said. "Then I'm going to talk to him like a man, not a boy." She nodded, the kind of nod that believes in difficult paths. Her fingers found mine. We stood like that for a whole minute, 2 senior citizens balancing on the small rock of our kitchen, the tide licking at our toes. Let me pause here and tell you something plain. If you are still with me, if your thumb hasn't wandered to some other screen, thank you. This story will not be all sorrow. It will have laughter that comes unexpectedly, like finding a 20 in an old coat. It will have kindness from strangers and courage from places I didn't know were inside me. And yes, it will have a test. The kind of test that prints numbers on paper and claims to know you better than the hours you carried a sleeping boy to bed. But before we get there, we have to tell the truth about this night, because healing is not a jump, it is a walk. I waited 2 days. On the 3rd, my son called. I could tell from the way his breath met the phone that he'd practiced the conversation in his head and forgotten all the lines. He asked if he could come by. "Of course," I said, 2 words that a father can say in 100 different seasons and mean them each time. He showed up in a jacket too thin for the wind. He carried his shoulders like suitcases. We sat on the porch where the paint peels no matter how often I promise it won't. For a while we talked about nothing. The weather, work, some TV show with too many characters. Our words were like shy dogs, circling, unwilling to come closer. Finally he said, "I didn't want to say it like that." I thought about telling him there is no good way to say some things. Instead I asked, "How did you want to say it?" He picked our splinter on the railing. He said the world was loud. He said people noticed he didn't resemble me, which is a silly sentence because I resemble me, and that has always been enough. He said he felt caught between voices, like a radio tuned to two stations at once. He said he was tired of explaining his own family to strangers. He said he wanted certainty. Certainty, such a young man's word. I looked at his hands, bigger than mine now, and I remembered teaching them to tie laces, to hold a bat, to keep from slamming the car door on his thumb. He had my carefulness, even if he didn't have my color. "I hear you," I said. I didn't say more because sometimes love is measured in what you don't add. When he left, I sat with his words. Certain. Real. These are bricks people build around themselves so they won't have to feel the wind. I respect a good wall, but I also know what it blocks out. That evening I opened a drawer in my desk, the one that sticks like it has its own opinions. I took out a pen and a piece of paper and wrote down a plan in the simplest language I know. Not to fight, not to prove, to seek a quiet truth, to hold it gently, to carry it if I had to, the way you carry a sleeping child, close to the chest, careful not to wake what isn't ready yet. There's more to say. There's so much more. Before we're done, you'll see the numbers and the faces, the rooms where decisions are made, the small miracles hiding in ordinary days. But for tonight, let this be enough. A table, a sentence, a father who did not get up and leave. A father who stayed. If my telling means something to you, if you've ever breathed through a pain you didn't ask for, stay with me. Click like so this story can find the ones who need it. Subscribe so you'll know when the next chapter arrives. We will walk this road together, step by step, from what was said to what is true, from what was broken to what can be mended. I promise you, there is more than blood at the end of this. I was 23 when I first saw her. It wasn't in a grand hall or under a chandelier the way movies teach you love appears. It was at the public library, the only place in town that smelled equally of dust and hope. She was in the aisle marked History. I was there looking for work listings on the community bulletin board. Funny, isn't it, how two lives can collide under a sign that says past? She had hair the color of wheat fields in July, and she tucked it behind her ear every few seconds as though she were reminding herself it belonged to her. Her dress was plain, her shoes scuffed, but her eyes, Lord, her eyes could make you want to step into the book she was holding just to sit beside her in the story. I didn't say anything that day. I walked out with my heart making promises my mouth wasn't ready to keep. A week later, fate, or maybe just a good librarian, placed us again in the same row. This time she looked up. This time she smiled. And I, a black man who had learned to carry silence like armor, decided to lay it down at least for one moment. I asked what she was reading. She showed me the cover. It was about journeys across oceans. "Sometimes you don't choose the journey," she said. "Sometimes it chooses you." That was the first thing she ever told me. Years later, when we were fighting through bills and prejudice and nights colder than the blanket could cover, I remembered that sentence and thought, maybe love chose me too. Her family did not approve. They didn't shout it at first. Disapproval can be a quiet thing, like a draft through a window you thought was shut. They invited me to dinner once. I wore my only tie, the one my mother had bought from a church thrift sale. I said yes ma'am and no sir until my jaw ached. Her father passed me the potatoes without looking at me. Her mother asked if I played basketball. I didn't. She looked disappointed. On the way home, my love slipped her hand into mine. "Don't mind them," she whispered. "They live in a world smaller than they realize. We'll build our own." And so we did. We married in a courthouse with cracked tiles. No organ music, no grand procession. Just two signatures, two rings we could barely afford, and two hearts insisting that the world had no right to tell them who belonged to whom. People stared at us on sidewalks. Some shook their heads, others whispered. Once outside the grocery store, a man muttered something about ruining bloodlines. I wanted to hit him. She squeezed my hand instead. Let's go home, she said. I listened. Because love teaches you which fights are worth it and which ones only steal your breath. When our son was born, I thought the world would finally understand. I thought a baby's cry was proof enough that love had won. I still remember holding him the first night. His body so small it felt like he'd slip through my fingers if I breathed too hard. His skin was lighter than mine, but I saw myself in the way his fist clung to my shirt. "You're mine," I whispered over and over until the words became a lullaby, but not everyone saw it that way. At the hospital, a nurse asked twice if I was the father. At the park, a woman leaned down to my boy and said, "Where's your daddy?" Even as I stood right there, he pointed to me. She blinked, laughed awkwardly, and walked away. I told myself it didn't matter, but small cuts can bleed for a long time. Still, we had our fortress. Our tiny apartment, our secondhand furniture, our Sunday mornings with pancakes burning on the stove, that was our kingdom. I worked 3 jobs, janitor by dawn, bus driver by day, warehouse hand by night. I came home smelling of bleach, gasoline, and dust. My wife said it smelled like sacrifice. She kissed me anyway. Every paycheck went to diapers, formula, rent. Sometimes I'd slip $1 into a jar marked college fund. I wanted my boy to have choices. I wanted him to step into the world without the chains I'd carried. At night, when I finally collapsed on the couch, I'd hear my son laugh in his sleep. That sound fixed everything. You can bear almost any weight if you believe you're carrying it for joy. Not that it was easy. Nothing worth keeping ever is. There were nights we argued. She'd say I was gone too much. I'd say bills don't pay themselves. She'd cry, not because of the money, but because she feared we were missing pieces of our boy's life. She was right. There were first steps I only heard about, not saw. There were school projects I came home too late to help with, but I tried to be there whenever I could because presence is a language children understand better than words. And he grew. Oh, how he grew. First into little league uniforms too big for his thin arms, then into high school sneakers that cost more than my week's groceries. He had my carefulness, his mother's stubborn streak, and a laugh that could fold the whole room in half. But the world doesn't always let joy live unbothered. By the time he was 12, kids at school had started asking questions. "Why's your dad so dark? Are you adopted?" He came home quiet those days, shutting himself in his room. I'd knock, offer ice cream, offer stories, offer silence. He always chose silence. I told myself it was a phase. Boys go through phases, but deep down a shadow began to grow, the shadow that one day he might believe the whispers instead of the truth. I am telling you all this because you need to understand. The night he said I wasn't his real dad, it wasn't born out of nowhere. It was seeded years before, watered by every stare, every comment, every silence I couldn't protect him from. Love is strong, but the world is loud. Sometimes too loud for a child's heart to hear what's right in front of him. Yet even now, even remembering the sting of his words, I cannot regret the life we built. I cannot regret choosing her, choosing him, choosing us. Because if love hadn't chosen me back in that library aisle, if I hadn't chosen it in return, there would be no story to tell you. There would be no son to lose, and no chance, maybe, to find him again. So when you hear me say I stayed through the cold stares, through the doubt, through the exhaustion, it wasn't because I was strong. It was because love had already chosen me and I didn't know how to refuse. Children don't remember their earliest years, but fathers do. We carry them like stones in our pockets, turning them over in our hands whenever silence gets too heavy. I remember the way his small palm fit inside mine, like a leaf tucked into an old book. He was barely 2 when I started walking him to the park. His shoes were red, cheap, and scuffed by the second week. Every few steps he'd trip, but each time he'd look up, laugh, and say, "Again, Daddy." I never knew 2 words could weigh so sweetly. People looked at us, of course. Some with curiosity, some with that smirk I've come to know like bad weather. They saw my dark hand and his lighter skin and decided the story without asking for the truth. Sometimes they whispered. Sometimes they didn't bother lowering their voices. That can't be his kid. Maybe she had someone else. I wonder if he knows. I knew. I knew more than they could imagine. I knew how many times I'd paced the floor with him pressed to my chest while Colic bent his tiny body in pain. I knew the sound of his first laugh, the way it bubbled out of him like a spring breaking through rock. I knew how to read his cries, the one for hunger, the one for tiredness, the one that simply meant he needed to feel a steady heartbeat against his ear. He didn't look like me, maybe, but he was mine in every way that mattered. On his first day of preschool, I ironed his little shirt 3 times. My wife teased me, said the teachers wouldn't notice, but I wanted the world to see him neat, cared for, claimed. I held his hand all the way to the classroom door. He clung to my leg for a minute, then walked in with the bravery only children can muster. As I left, another parent muttered under their breath, "Strange pairing." I clenched my jaw until it ached. I didn't answer. You learn not every battle needs your blood. Some battles you win simply by showing up again the next morning. And I did. Every morning. Rain or shine, I was there. Dropping him off, picking him up, listening to his little stories spill out in that sing-song way kids have when they believe the world will always listen. By the time he was 6, I taught him how to ride a bike. Our street had a gentle slope, just enough to give him speed but not enough to break bones. I ran behind him, one hand steady on the seat. "Don't let go," he shouted. "Not until I'm ready." "I won't," I promised. But of course every father knows the truth. You always have to let go sooner than you want. He pedaled, wobbled, found his balance. For a moment he was flying. He didn't notice I'd released him until he glanced back. When he saw my empty hands, his face lit up. "Daddy, I did it." That's the thing about children. They don't care who claps for them. They care who ran beside them until their legs were strong enough. Yet, alongside the joy, the whispers grew louder. At the grocery store, a cashier once asked, "Are you babysitting today?" I smiled tightly. "Every day," I said. The woman chuckled, not realizing how deep her question cut. At a birthday party, another kid asked him why his dad looked so different. He came home quiet that night, staring at his cereal instead of eating. "Why do they say that?" he finally asked. I wanted to tell him the world was cruel sometimes, that people carried ignorance the way others carried lunch bags. Instead, I pulled him onto my lap, kissed the top of his head, and said, "They don't know what love looks like. That's their problem, not ours." He nodded, not fully convinced. But children believe what you repeat. So I repeated it over and over, hoping one day it would settle into the roots of his being. Still, the doubts crept in. Not his, not yet. Mine. I'd lie awake some nights and wonder, was I giving him enough to stand against the tide? Could love outweigh the world's suspicion? Would he grow up strong enough to claim me when the whispers told him not to? And yet, the next morning, he'd crawl into my lap with his toy cars and the questions melted. He didn't care what the world said. He only cared that I was there to play, to push the car across the floor and make engine noises until we both laughed so hard our sides ached. One afternoon when he was about 8, we were walking home from school. A group of boys passed us, older, rougher. One of them shouted, "That's not your real dad." My son froze. His little hand tightened around mine. He looked up at me, eyes wide, searching. My heart clenched. This was the moment. I crouched down, met his gaze, and said, "Blood or no blood, I'm yours, that's real enough." He blinked, then smiled, small but real. He squeezed my hand harder, and we kept walking. I thought that smile would be enough to last us. I thought those words would anchor him through the storms ahead. But storms, as I would learn, have a way of wearing even the strongest anchors down. There comes a time when a boy's laughter changes. It's no longer the open-mouthed giggle of childhood, the kind that makes neighbors smile through their curtains. It turns sharper, shorter, guarded, as if every sound he makes must first pass inspection. My son was about 12 when his laughter began to fade like that. At first, I thought it was just adolescence. Boys grow quiet, pull into themselves, build fortresses of privacy. I expected mood swings, slammed doors, muttered answers. What I didn't expect was the way the world would loan him its voice, whispering things that would wedge themselves between us. Middle school is cruel. It always has been. Children repeat what they hear at home, and at home they hear more than love. They hear prejudice, suspicion, ignorance disguised as humor. He came home one day, tossed his backpack onto the couch, and didn't even look at me. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Nothing." That word is the anthem of teenagers, but his nothing carried weight. It sagged his shoulders. Later that night, while he sat at the table pushing pasta around his plate, I tried again. "Rough day," he shrugged. "Some kids said stuff." "What kind of stuff?" He stared at the noodles. "They said you're not my real dad, that I must be adopted." My chest tightened. I wanted to march to that school, stand in the hallway, and tell every child the truth. But you can't fight ignorance with volume. You fight it by being constant, steady, present. "They're wrong," I said. "You know that." He didn't answer. That silence was sharper than any insult. As the years passed, those silences grew. He started asking his mother for help with homework instead of me. When relatives came by, he sat closer to them, soaking up their attention. Some of her family, her cousins, her aunts, still carried the same quiet disapproval they had when we first married. They'd smile at me politely, then lean toward him and whisper, "You're so lucky to have your mother's side. That's where you get your good looks." He never corrected them. He just smiled, as if it felt good to belong somewhere, even if it meant stepping away from me. At family gatherings, I found myself at the edges. Once, during Thanksgiving, I overheard one of her uncles saying, "Well, at least the boy doesn't take after him." He laughed, fork clinking against his plate. I pretended not to hear, but my son did. He didn't laugh. He didn't defend me either. He just lowered his eyes. There were other moments too, smaller, but they cut just as deep. At the mall, a cashier asked if we were together. My son hesitated before answering yes. On the basketball court, someone shouted, "Hey, is that your coach or your dad?" He looked away. When we went out to eat, the waiter sometimes assumed we weren't related. "Separate checks?" they'd ask. Each time I smiled politely, said, "He's my son," loud enough for him to hear. Each time he shifted in his seat, uncomfortable, as if my love embarrassed him. I tried to bridge the gap. I took him fishing one summer the way my own father had taken me. We sat by the lake, lines drooping into the water. I told him stories about when I was his age, riding bikes down cracked sidewalks, sneaking into old movie theaters, hearing Motown on a neighbor's radio. He listened, but his eyes kept straying to his phone. "Boring?" I asked with a smile. "No, Dad," he muttered, but he didn't look at me. It was in that moment I realized I was no longer his hero. I was becoming background noise. Still, I kept showing up. I drove him to practice, cheered at his games, even when he barely acknowledged me in the stands. I worked overtime to buy him the sneakers he wanted, the ones with a name that cost 3 times more than the shoes I wore to work. He said thanks, but not with his eyes. At night, my wife would touch my hand, whisper, "It's just a phase." But in my heart, I feared it was more, not just adolescence, not just rebellion. It was the echo of every whisper he'd ever heard, every doubt planted by strangers, every half-smile from family who didn't want me to belong. The world had given him its voice, and slowly, painfully, he had begun to use it against me. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to find him in the living room with a friend. They were laughing about something, leaning close, talking in the quick, careless way teenagers do. I stepped inside, set down my lunch pail, and said, "Hey, son." He froze. His friend looked at me, then back at him. "That's your dad?" the boy asked. My son hesitated, just for a second, but a second is enough to split a father's heart. "Yes," he said finally, voice low. His friend nodded, unimpressed, and the conversation shifted back to sports. But the damage was done. That hesitation lodged inside me like a splinter. I began to wonder if maybe love wasn't enough. If maybe blood really did matter more than years of holding, teaching, staying. But then I'd see him asleep on the couch after practice, mouth open, hair falling into his eyes, and my heart would argue back, "No, he's mine. He always will be." Still, the space between us widened, a gulf you could almost measure in the air. I reached across it every day. Sometimes he reached back. More often, he didn't. And so I braced myself, though I didn't know it then, for the moment he would stop reaching altogether. Family dinners are supposed to be noisy, forks clinking, voices tumbling over each other, the television murmuring in the background while no one really watches. But that night, the noise felt different. It was brittle, like glass waiting for a crack. My wife had made roast chicken, the smell of rosemary filling every corner of the house. My son was home from college for the weekend. He sat at the end of the table, taller now, shoulders squared in that way young men carry themselves when they want to look older than they feel. There were cousins too, and an aunt who never liked me much. We started with small talk, grades, jobs, a cousin's new car. I tried to join in, but every word I spoke seemed to hover awkwardly in the air before dropping to the tablecloth. My son barely looked at me. Halfway through the meal, someone asked him who he looked up to most. A simple question, the kind that usually draws an easy smile. He set down his fork, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and said, honestly, not him. Silence, I blinked. Not who, I asked, though my chest already knew the answer. He looked at me then, really looked, and there was something cold in his eyes I'd never seen before. You're not my real father, you never were. The words didn't just land, they detonated. The cousins exchanged glances. His aunt smirked faintly, as if she'd been waiting years for this confession. My wife froze, her hand on the serving spoon, knuckles white. I sat there, the steam rising from my plate like smoke from a battlefield. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist down, to demand, after everything, after all I gave. But instead I heard my own breath, uneven, betraying me. He wasn't done. People at school used to ask me all the time. I told them you weren't. I mean, look at us. Do we even look related? It's obvious. Each word was another knife, carefully placed. I thought of all the nights I'd carried him to bed when he fell asleep on the couch. Of the scraped knees I'd bandaged, the long drives to away games, the extra shifts I worked to pay for his books. And here he was, dismissing it all with a shrug. My wife finally spoke. Enough, she whispered, but her voice cracked. She didn't say he was wrong, she didn't defend me. She just wanted the scene to end. That was the cruelest part. Not just his denial, but the quiet agreement in the room, the way no one leapt to my side. I stared down at my plate, the food now tasteless. I picked up a piece of bread, broke it in half, and chewed slowly to keep from speaking. Because I knew if I opened my mouth, the words would come out jagged, and once jagged words leave, they never return whole. So I swallowed his rejection like I swallowed that bread, dry, heavy, lodging in my throat. Inside, though, something collapsed. A scaffolding I had spent decades building with love and labor crumbled in a second. After dinner, the family moved to the living room. Laughter returned, forced and thin, as if nothing had happened. I stayed behind, stacking plates, rinsing them under water that ran too hot. My hands stung, but I didn't turn the faucet down. I needed to feel something sharp to drown the dull ache in my chest. My son passed through the kitchen to grab a soda. He didn't even meet my eyes. As he walked away, I whispered, too quiet for anyone else, but loud enough for me. I was there, every day. Doesn't that count for something? He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't hear, or maybe he did, and silence was the only reply he had left. That night when the house emptied, I sat alone at the table again. The candles had burned low, wax pooling like melted time. I thought about leaving, just walking out, letting them all see what life was without me. Maybe then they would measure my worth. But fathers don't walk away, even when the world calls them frauds, even when their own children spit doubt into their faces. Fathers stay. I stayed. But in that staying, a decision began to form, quiet as a seed breaking soil. If my son wanted proof, I would give it. Not to win him back with paper, but to remind myself that love and blood are not enemies. That night I did not sleep. The bed was warm beside me, my wife breathing softly, her hand curled near her chin, but my mind was a furnace. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice again, "You're not my real father." The words echoed against my ribs, sharp as nails, hammering through every hour until the night felt endless. I stared at the ceiling. The cracks in the plaster looked like rivers on a map, running away from each other. I thought, that's us. Me and him. Two lines that once ran together, now splitting farther with every mile. I turned onto my side, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, the memories arrived. one after another, as if my life had been rewound and was playing back in cruel detail. I saw myself working late nights at the warehouse, my shoulders aching from lifting boxes twice my weight. I'd come home past midnight, peel off boots caked in dust, and tiptoe into his room just to check his breathing. I used to stand there for minutes, watching his chest rise and fall, whispering a prayer of thanks that he was mine. I saw the time he broke his arm falling from the jungle gym. The hospital bill was more than we had in savings. I worked double shifts for months, my knuckles splitting open from the cold. But when I came home, he was already bragging to his friends about how his dad carried him into the ER like Superman. I'd never felt prouder. I saw the birthdays where I scraped together enough for presents wrapped in second-hand paper. The look on his face when he tore it open, surprise, joy, love, was all the payment I needed. These were my proofs, not numbers, not percentages. My proof was in sweat and sacrifice, in the lines carved into my hands. So why wasn't it enough for him? The clock ticked past 3 a.m. I sat up, heart heavy, and went to the living room. The floorboards groaned under my weight, old companions that never kept secrets. I poured a glass of water, but it tasted like air. I sat in the dark, turning the glass in my hand. And then the thought came, dangerous, persistent. What if he's right? What if I'm not? I hated myself for even considering it. But once a thought enters, it doesn't leave. It circles. It whispers. I imagined the possibility that my wife had once, long ago, hidden a truth from me, that I had built my entire life on a lie, that the blood in his veins might belong to someone else. My hands shook. The glass clinked against my teeth. At dawn, when the first light slipped through the curtains, I was still awake. My wife stirred, rubbed her eyes, asked if I was coming to bed. In a minute, I said, but I didn't move. She studied me for a long moment. Then she sighed and went back to bed. I was grateful. I couldn't have told her even if I tried. The decision settled on me slowly, like snow covering a field, quiet, cold, inevitable. If he needed proof, I would find it, not for me. I already knew who I was, but maybe if I held the truth in my hands, he would see it too. Maybe the paper would silence the voices in his head, the ones the world had planted there. I told myself it was for him, but deep down I knew it was also for me. I needed to silence that whisper, that cruel question gnawing at my chest. What if he's right? The next morning, I called the clinic. My voice shook more than I wanted it to. I'd like to schedule a DNA test, I said. The receptionist didn't flinch. For her, it was routine. For me, it was the heaviest sentence I'd ever spoken. She gave me a date. I wrote it down on the back of an old bill, hands trembling. When I hung up, I sat there staring at the ink, realizing I had just set something in motion that could not be undone. That night before I went to bed, I walked into his room. He was asleep, his face softened, younger somehow, like when he was a boy. I stood in the doorway, my heart splitting between love and fear. I whispered, even if the test says no, I'll still say yes. Always. He didn't stir, but maybe, somewhere in his dreaming, he heard me. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and old paper, a place designed to feel clean but never quite warm. The chairs in the waiting room were lined up like soldiers, stiff-backed, unforgiving. I sat in one near the corner, clutching the clipboard of forms they'd handed me. My name, my birthdate, his name, his birthdate, simple questions that suddenly weighed like stones. I wrote slowly, as if neat handwriting could somehow prove my worth. My hand trembled when I filled the line marked relationship to child. I wrote, Father. Then I stared at the word until the letters blurred. The receptionist called my name. My legs felt heavier than they had in years, but they carried me forward. A nurse in blue scrubs led me down a narrow hallway. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like nervous insects. Have a seat, she said, motioning to a small chair beside a counter. The chair squeaked under my weight. She prepared the syringe, movements quick, practiced, indifferent. I tried to steady my breathing. I've faced long nights at factories, racist stares on sidewalks, bills that didn't add up, but this felt different. This was judgment in liquid form, drawn from my veins, waiting to be compared against the blood of the boy I raised. Left arm okay? She asked. Yes, I said, though my throat was dry. She tied the band around my bicep, tapped the crook of my arm. The vein rose obedient, betraying me. As the needle slipped in, a sharp sting bit me. I clenched my jaw, not from pain, I've known worse, but from the knowledge that this small vial might redefine everything. "Almost done," she said, sliding the tube off the syringe. She labeled it with my name, my birthday, numbers that felt too clinical for the storm inside me. When it was over, she pressed cotton to my arm, taped it down, and smiled politely. "That's it. You're good to go." Good to go. I almost laughed, as if walking out of here would be easy, as if my life hadn't just been funneled into a glass vial to be measured, dissected, judged. I stepped outside. The sunlight felt foreign, too bright for what I carried. People walked past me, casual, unconcerned. They bought coffee, checked their phones, argued about parking spaces. None of them knew that in my pocket sat a receipt for my fatherhood. I walked to the bus stop, sat on the metal bench. My arm still throbbed faintly where the needle had gone in. I pressed my hand there, as though I could keep the blood from telling secrets I wasn't ready to hear. The days that followed were endless. Every ring of the phone startled me. Every envelope in the mailbox felt like it might contain my entire life. At night, I lay awake, imagining both outcomes. If it said yes, if the paper proved what my heart already knew, maybe he would finally believe me. Maybe he would see that the whispers were lies. But if it said no, if it said I had loved another man's child all these years, I stopped the thought there. I couldn't follow it. One evening, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. I studied my face, the lines, the gray in my beard, the deep-set eyes tired from decades of work. Then I imagined his face beside mine. People said we didn't look alike, but I saw it. In the arch of his brow, in the way he narrowed his eyes when thinking, I saw myself, or maybe I wanted to. I leaned closer to the mirror, whispered, "You are his father. No paper can change that." But the truth is, I was afraid that paper could. The waiting was a test all its own. And each day I prayed the result would not only confirm what I already believed, but that somehow it would rebuild the bridge between us. Because love had been my only proof, and I needed him to see it wasn't just love. It was blood, too. The hardest part wasn't the needle. It wasn't even signing my name on the clinic form, watching the nurse tuck away a vial that felt like it held more than blood. The hardest part was the waiting. Days stretched long and silent. The house seemed quieter than usual, as though even the walls were holding their breath. My wife went about her routines, watering plants, folding laundry, humming old songs under her breath. But I could see her eyes flick toward me, curious, worried, knowing something was different. I didn't tell her, not yet. At night, the waiting room in my head filled with memories. One by one, they stepped forward like witnesses in a trial. Each one looked me in the eye and asked, "Doesn't this prove you are his father?" I remembered the first time he fell off his bike. His knees were scraped raw, tears streaming down his cheeks. I scooped him up, carried him inside. While my wife fetched the bandages, he clung to me as if I were the only safe ground left in the world. I can still feel the tremor of his small body against my chest, the way his breath shuddered in and out until he calmed. Tell me, how is that not fatherhood? Another memory, a cold night when the power went out. He was maybe 7. The house sank into darkness and fear crept into his voice. "Dad," he whispered. I lit a candle, set it on the table, and told him stories by the flickering light. He laughed at the funny ones, gasped at the scary ones, and finally fell asleep with his head on my shoulder. That night the candle burned low, but something brighter burned between us. Then came the baseball game. He was 9. He struck out 3 times in a row. His shoulders slumped, his cap hung low. Some kids laughed. I walked to the dugout, crouched in front of him, and said, "It's not about how many times you miss. It's about how many times you swing again." He looked at me, eyes wet, and nodded. The next inning he swung. And when the bat cracked against the ball, when he ran those bases with joy spilling out of him, I thought, this is what it means to be a father, not fixing every failure but teaching him to rise after each one. But then other memories came, less kind. The first time he asked me why we didn't look alike. He was 10, his voice hesitant, as if he'd been holding the question for years. I told him love makes people belong more than faces do. He smiled, but his eyes searched mine, still uncertain. The middle school years when he came home quiet, carrying the sting of cruel jokes. He never told me everything, but I heard enough. Each silence between us grew a little wider, a little colder. And finally, that dinner, the words that cut deeper than any knife. You're not my real father. The memories circled, pressing against me like lawyers in a courtroom. Some defended me, some accused me. Each night I lay in bed, the verdict unresolved. I told myself the test will be the gavel, it will end the trial. But even as I clung to that hope, another voice whispered, what if the test betrays you? What if love has been a long mistake? I hated that voice, but it was there. And in the long hours before dawn, it grew louder. One morning, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee gone cold. Outside, the neighborhood kids biked past, their laughter drifting through the window. I closed my eyes, and just for a moment I heard my boy's laugh again, the one he had when he was 5, high and bright and unashamed. That sound was my evidence, stronger than paper, stronger than DNA, but would he believe it? That was the question that gnawed at me. The waiting continued. Every day I checked the mailbox, my hands trembling as if expecting a lightning strike inside an envelope. Every phone call startled me as though the result might leap through the line. And still, the memories kept coming, relentless. Sweet ones, bitter ones, all blending into one truth. My fatherhood had already been lived, tested, proven in scraped knees, bedtime stories, strikeouts, and second chances. Yet the world said proof must be written in percentages and paternity reports. And my son, my boy, believed the world. So I waited, caught between two verdicts, the one written in my heart and the one about to arrive in the mail. The envelope was thinner than I expected. After weeks of waiting, after nights of pacing and memories crashing into each other, it arrived in the simplest disguise, a plain white envelope, my name typed in small black letters. I held it in my hands as if it were alive. My palms were damp. My breath caught. For a long while, I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at it, afraid to break the seal. What if it said no? What if decades of love could be undone in a single paragraph? I pressed the envelope to my chest and closed my eyes. I whispered a prayer, not for the result, but for the strength to survive whatever it said. Then finally, I tore it open. The paper slid out, crisp and official. Words swam before me until I found the line I had been waiting for. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. My throat closed, my vision blurred. For a moment, I thought my body might collapse right there in the chair. I read it again just to be sure. Then again, 99.9, father, undeniable. A sob tore out of me uninvited. My hands shook as I pressed the paper against my face. Tears soaked into it, smudging the ink, but I didn't care. All those years, all the doubts, all the whispers, they were wrong. I was his father, not just in heart, not just in sacrifice, but in blood. I wanted to run to him, shove the paper into his hands, shout, see, see, I told you. I wanted the vindication, the relief of proving the world wrong. But then I stopped. Because as much as I longed for his recognition, I realized something in that moment. I had never needed this paper to know the truth. I had lived the truth every day of his life. And if I didn't need the paper, then why was I so desperate for him to? I set it down on the table, smoothed the wrinkles my tears had made. The silence of the kitchen wrapped around me. The refrigerator hummed. A clock ticked. Outside, a bird called once and flew away. I whispered to myself, even if it had said otherwise, I would still be his father. Because fatherhood was never about numbers. It was about scraped knees, bedtime stories, long shifts, small sacrifices. The test confirmed what I already knew, but it didn't define me. I folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the envelope. I tucked it into the drawer beside old photos and birthday cards, a place where history and love already lived. I told myself, I'll show him when the time is right, not as a weapon, not as revenge, but as a gift. Proof, yes, but also a promise. I chose you long before a lab confirmed it. That night I slept for the first time in weeks. The bed felt softer, the air lighter. And yet a new question stirred in me, restless and sharp. Would he care about the paper? Or had the world's voice already grown too loud for even 99.9% to silence? I turned onto my side, whispered into the darkness, "Please, son, please see me." I waited a week before calling him. A week of carrying that envelope in my pocket like a second heartbeat. At work, at church, even while mowing the lawn, I felt its weight, reminding me of both relief and responsibility. Finally, one Sunday afternoon, I dialed his number. My hand trembled more than it should have. "Can you come by?" I asked. He hesitated. I could hear the noise of his life in the background, television, laughter, the thrum of youth that had no space for old men like me. But after a pause, he said, "Yeah, I'll come." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he once spread crayons across the surface, where we blew out birthday candles, where he had cut me open with words weeks earlier. Now it felt like a courtroom, the envelope between us a silent judge. He leaned back, arms crossed, eyes wary. "So what's this about?" I took a deep breath, slid the envelope closer, but kept my hand on it. "I had the test done," I said. His eyes widened, then narrowed. You really did that?" "I did." He stared at the envelope, jaw tight, and I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at him, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders, the young man who once held my hand crossing the street. I thought about all the years I had been his anchor and all the storms we'd weathered together. And then I said, "Before you open it, you need to hear this. Even if the test had said no, even if it had told me I wasn't your father, I would still choose to be. Every single day, do you understand? Love isn't something a lab can measure, it's a choice. And I've chosen you from the moment you were placed in my arms." The room went quiet. He shifted in his seat, staring down at the envelope like it might burn him. His lips parted, closed again. For the first time in years, he looked uncertain. Not defiant, not angry, just a boy caught between the voices in his head and the truth in front of him. Finally, with a shaky breath, he reached for the envelope. He tore it open, eyes scanning the page. I watched his face as the numbers registered. I saw the walls he'd built tremble. His mouth opened slightly as if he might speak, but no words came. He looked up at me, eyes glistening. "It says 99.9%, he whispered. I nodded, yes, but I didn't need that paper to know. For a long moment he said nothing. His hands trembled as he held the test, as though it carried more weight than he could bear. I leaned forward, voice gentle. "Son, I don't want to win an argument. I don't want to be right. I just want you to know, whether it's written on paper or not, I am your father. Not because of this result, but because of every meal I worked to put on this table, every night I sat up with you when you were sick, every sacrifice I made without ever asking for thanks." His eyes filled. He blinked fast, like he was trying to dam something back. You still would have stayed, even if," his voice cracked. "Even if," I said firmly. Silence again, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was heavy with something else, something shifting. He folded the paper slowly, slid it back into the envelope and pushed it toward me. "I don't need to keep it," he murmured. I placed my hand over his. Warmth met warmth. For the first time in years, he didn't pull away. I don't know how long we sat there, the envelope between us, both of us staring not at the paper but at the space we might finally begin to close. And for the first time since that awful night at dinner, hope stirred in me again, fragile, trembling, but alive. He sat across from me, shoulders hunched, fingers pressed against the envelope like it was a live wire. For years he had worn his pride like armor, every glance and word sharpened to keep me at a distance. But now, in the quiet of our kitchen, something cracked. His chest rose sharply, his lips parted, then without warning the tears came. Not the silent, hidden kind, but heavy sobs that racked his frame, shaking the table between us. I froze. My boy, my son who had built walls so high I thought I'd never climb them, was crying. "Dad," he choked. The word landed like lightning. It had been years since he'd called me that. I felt it spark through me, electrifying every nerve. My throat tightened, my eyes burned. I stood, moved to his side. For a moment I hesitated. Would he push me away like before? Would he reject even my comfort? But when I reached out, he collapsed against me, burying his face in my chest the way he once did when nightmares chased him from sleep. His arms wrapped around me, hesitant at first, then desperate, clutching as though he feared I might vanish if he let go. We stayed like that, father and son, bound not by proof but by need. His tears soaked into my shirt. My hand found the back of his head, stroking gently, as if he were still that little boy needing reassurance that monsters weren't real. Except the monsters had been real. They just didn't live under his bed. They lived in whispers, in prejudice, in doubts planted by others. And for too long he had believed them. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "I'm so sorry." I closed my eyes. "You don't have to be sorry, just be here. That's all I ever wanted." Yet even as joy flooded me, even as my arms held him tighter, I couldn't ignore the sting that lingered. The years lost. The words spoken that could never be unsaid. Forgiveness heals, but scars remain. When he finally pulled back, his face was red, streaked with tears. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, embarrassed like a child caught crying. "I didn't know," he whispered. I thought I was supposed to listen to them. They all said it didn't make sense." I nodded slowly. "The world's loud, son, sometimes louder than love, but love doesn't stop speaking even when you stop listening." We sat again, side by side now. The envelope lay between us, silent, unnecessary. He touched it once more. "It shouldn't have taken this," he said bitterly. "No," I admitted, "but maybe it did. Maybe sometimes we need proof just to realize we never needed it in the first place." He let out a shaky laugh, half joy, half pain. That night before he left, he hugged me again at the door. "I'll come by more," he promised, voice softer than I'd heard in years. I believed him, but I also knew healing isn't instant. Wounds close slowly, sometimes unevenly. The bitterness of what was said would always shadow us, but maybe, just maybe, the shadow would grow thinner with time. As I watched him walk to his car, shoulders less burdened than before, I whispered into the quiet street, "Thank you, God, for bringing my son back to me." And somewhere deep inside, despite the scars, peace began to take root. The house is quiet now. The plates are washed, the candles long burned down, the echoes of anger and doubt faded into memory. I sit at the same kitchen table where my son once denied me, where he later called me dad again with tears in his eyes. It feels almost holy, this table. Scarred by years of meals, arguments, laughter, silence, it has carried the weight of our family. And so have I. I think back on the journey, the library where I first met his mother, the hospital where I first held him, the playgrounds, the scraped knees, the long nights of work, the doubts, the whispers, the silence that nearly swallowed us whole. And then the paper, that thin slip of proof, 99.9%. But you know what? That paper mattered less than the moment he clung to me and called me dad, because fatherhood was never about biology. It was never about skin or blood or percentages on a page. It was about choosing every day to show up, to stay, to love even when love wasn't returned. If you're listening to me now, maybe you've felt something like this. Maybe you've been told you weren't enough, that you didn't belong, that your love didn't count. I want to tell you it does. Love always counts, even when the world doubts it, even when people whisper otherwise. My son doubted me. The world doubted me. For a moment, even I doubted myself. But love endured. It always does. When I look at him now, I don't see the distance that once separated us. I see the boy I carried on my shoulders, the young man who finally broke down and came back to me. I see not just blood, but bond. Not just proof, but promise. And I see myself, not a perfect father, not without mistakes, but a man who chose to love beyond measure. A man who kept choosing even when it hurt. To all of you who have walked with me through this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for staying, for letting me share the hardest and most beautiful parts of my life. If my story has touched you, if you felt the weight of love or the ache of rejection, know this: you are not alone. Love is stronger than doubt, stronger than prejudice, stronger than any piece of paper. I pray you carry that truth into your own life. So here is my parting word: fatherhood, motherhood, family, they are not written only in blood. They are written in sacrifice, in time, in forgiveness, in choosing love again and again. That is what I have learned. That is what I hope you carry. And now, as I close this chapter, let me speak directly to you, the ones who have sat with me until the end. Thank you From my heart to yours, I wish you health, peace, and love that endures. Hug your family tighter tonight. Say the words you've been holding back. Life is too short for silence. If this story has meant something to you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it, so others can be reminded that love, in the end, is always more than blood. Good night, my friends. May love guide you as it has guided me.